A German shepherd had his mouth sealed shut with hot glue, unable to call for help. But a baby's action. As he approached left, everyone in shock. Subscribe and see how that simple gesture revealed an unbelievable scene. The morning unfolded, like any other in the sleepy town of Pine Haven, Montana, where time seemed to flow as gently as the creek that meandered through its rolling hills. Nestled between mountain ranges and sprawling farmland, this was a place where neighbors still brought casseroles when someone fell ill and where front doors remained unlocked through the night. Life here followed the predictable rhythm of generations past, unmarred by the frenetic pace that defined the world beyond their valley. Sarah Mitchell stood on the weathered porch of her family's farmhouse, the structure having withstood nearly a century of Montana winters. At 32, she'd returned to her hometown after years in Seattle, bringing with her 6-month-old Noah, whose father had decided family life wasn't for him. The move back had been hard, but necessary. A single mother needed a support system, and here at least she had her parents nearby and a community that still believed in looking after its own. The late May sunshine warmed her face as she watched Noah playing on his blanket, reaching for the wooden toys her father had carved for him. The baby's laughter, pure and uninhibited, made the struggles of single motherhood worthwhile. Today was shaping up to be perfectly ordinary, until it wasn't. The scream that tore through the morning stillness didn't come from human vocal cords. It was a howl, desperate and chilling, that carried across the fields and settled around Sarah like an unwelcome premonition. Noah, who had been contentedly babbling moments before, went silent. His tiny body stiffened and his eyes widened, fixed on something beyond the porch, as though he could see through the distance itself. "What is it, sweetie?" Sarah knelt beside him, following his gaze toward the old railroad tracks that cut through their property about half a mile away. The abandoned Burlington Northern Line had once been the lifeblood of towns like Pine Haven, but now stood as a relic of more prosperous times. Freight trains still occasionally rumbled through, though passenger service had ended decades ago. The tracks were a boundary of sorts, separating the Mitchell farm from the denser woods beyond. The howling came again, more urgent this time, a sound of pure anguish that raised goosebumps along Sarah's arms. Then inexplicably, Noah began to cry. Not his usual hungry cry or tired whimper, but something visceral and pained, as though he felt whatever distress was being broadcast across the fields. "Mom!" Sarah called through the screen door where her mother Ellen was preparing lunch. "Can you watch Noah for a bit? I need to check something." Ellen appeared, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. "What's that awful noise?" "I don't know. Sounds like an animal in trouble." Sarah was already pulling on her boots. "Noah's acting strange too. I'll be back soon." "Take the rifle," her mother cautioned, lifting the still wailing Noah into her arms. "I won't need it," Sarah replied, though she grabbed her cell phone from the kitchen counter. Whatever was happening, it didn't feel dangerous, just wrong somehow. The walk to the tracks took less than 10 minutes, the desperate howls guiding her across the meadow and through the stand of aspens that partially obscured the railway. Line from view, what Sarah discovered left her momentarily frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. A large German shepherd, its coat the color of burnished copper and black coal, was tethered to the railroad ties with thick rope that bit cruelly into its neck. The animal thrashed wildly, eyes wide with panic, as though it knew what fate awaited it on those sun-baked tracks. In the distance, perhaps a mile away, Sarah could hear the low rumble of an approaching freight train. "Oh my God," she breathed, rushing forward without a second thought. The dog's barking intensified as she approached, not in aggression, but desperation. When their eyes met, Sarah felt something inexplicable pass between them, a communication beyond language, a recognition that cut deeper than reason could explain. The animal stilled momentarily, its amber eyes fixed on hers with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "It's okay, boy. I'm going to help you." Her voice was steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The knots were tight, deliberately so, and Sarah's fingers soon became raw as she worked to loosen them. The train's rumble grew louder. She could feel vibrations in the metal tracks beneath her knees. Come on," she muttered, finally managing to create enough slack to pull the rope over the dog's head. The moment it was free, the animal bounded a few yards away, then turned back to face her, seemingly torn between flight and something else, something Sarah couldn't quite define. She scrambled off the tracks just as the train rounded the bend, its horn blaring a warning. The conductor, spotting her near the tracks, leaned out his window with a concerned expression as the massive engine thundered past. Sarah waved to indicate she was fine, breathing heavily from the rush of fear and relief. When the last car had disappeared around the next curve, Sarah expected the German Shepherd to be gone as well. Instead, it stood watching her from about 20 feet away, its posture alert but no longer panicked. "Are you hurt?" she asked softly, extending her hand palm up, the way her grandfather had taught her to approach unfamiliar farm dogs. The shepherd took a tentative step forward, then another, until its muzzle nudged against her fingers. There was no collar, but the animal's coat, despite being dusty from its struggle, showed signs of previous care. This wasn't a stray that had lived rough for years. Someone had owned this dog, perhaps recently. "Who would do this to you?" Sarah murmured, carefully checking for injuries. The rope had left raw marks on the dog's neck, but otherwise, it seemed physically unharmed. As Sarah began the walk back to the farmhouse, the German Shepherd followed at a respectful distance. Each time she looked back, those intelligent eyes met hers, as though measuring her worth, her trustworthiness. By the time they reached the edge of the aspen grove, the dog had closed the gap between them, now walking steadily at her side. Ellen was waiting on the porch, Noah still in her arms. Remarkably, the baby had stopped crying. When he caught sight of the dog, his little face broke into a smile of recognition that puzzled Sarah. It was as though he'd been expecting this visitor, this unlikely rescue. "I found your noisemaker," Sarah called up to her mother. "Someone tied him to the tracks." Ellen's face darkened with disgust. "Who would do such a thing? Does he have tags?" "Nothing, but he's well fed, or was, until recently." Sarah climbed the porch steps, the dog remaining at ground level, watching the interaction warily. "We should call animal control." At those words, the German Shepherd's ears flattened against its head. Once again, Sarah had the unnerving feeling that the animal understood far more than a dog should. Noah began squirming in Ellen's arms, reaching toward the newcomer with insistent grunts. When Ellen reluctantly lowered him to his blanket on the porch floor, the baby immediately began the determined crawling motion he'd only recently mastered, heading straight for the steps where the dog waited. "Noah, no!" Sarah started moving to intercept him, but froze when the German Shepherd carefully climbed 2 steps, just enough to bring itself level with the approaching infant. The dog lowered its massive head, gently touching its nose to Noah's outstretched fingers. What happened next would be something Sarah would struggle to explain to anyone who hadn't witnessed it. Noah pulled himself to a sitting position and leaned his forehead against the dog's muzzle. The animal remained perfectly still, eyes half closed in what could only be described as contentment. After a moment, Noah giggled, that pure sound of infant joy, and the German Shepherd responded with a soft whine that sounded almost like answering laughter. "Well," Ellen said softly from behind them, "I think someone just found himself a guardian." Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from the tableau before her. Her baby and this mysterious dog communicating in some primal language beyond her understanding. Something deeper than coincidence had brought this animal to their lives. She felt it with a certainty that defied logical explanation. "What should we call him?" she asked. knowing already that the decision about keeping the dog had somehow been taken out of her hands. As if in answer, Noah patted the dog's muzzle and made a sound that resembled Ray, one of his few proto-words. "Ray," Sarah repeated. "Is that what we should call you, boy?" The German shepherd's ears perked up, and it made a soft huffing sound that could have been agreement. In that moment, with the Montana sun casting long afternoon shadows across the porch, Sarah felt the first stirrings of what would become an extraordinary chain of events. One that would unearth long-buried secrets and forge connections none of them could have anticipated. The following days settled into an uneasy routine at the Mitchell farm. Sarah had called the local sheriff's office to report finding Ray tied to the tracks, and Deputy Jim Wallace had come by to take photographs of the rope marks on the dog's neck. He promised to ask around town about missing German shepherds, but his expression suggested he didn't hold much hope for finding whoever had been responsible. Could have been kids, he'd suggested half-heartedly, though none of them really believed that. The knots had been too deliberate, the location too specific. This hadn't been a prank gone wrong. Sarah had taken Ray to Dr. Amelia Foster, Pinehaven's only veterinarian, who confirmed the dog was approximately 4 years old, unneutered, and despite the recent trauma, in excellent health. More puzzling was the absence of a microchip. A purebred like this? Usually they're chipped, Dr. Foster had said, running, her hands along Ray's muscular flanks. Someone invested good money in this dog. German shepherds from quality lines don't come cheap. They'd put up notices around town and online, but a week passed with no one coming forward to claim Ray. The dog had seamlessly integrated himself into their household, displaying impeccable house manners and an uncanny gentleness with Noah. At night, he positioned himself beside the baby's crib, alert to every sound. During the day, he followed Sarah like a shadow, except when Noah was napping. Then he stationed himself outside the nursery door like a furry sentinel. "It's almost like he was trained as a service dog," Sarah remarked to her father, Frank, as they watched Ray meticulously clear his paws before entering the house after a rainy afternoon walk. But not quite. It's more like he's listening for something. Frank Mitchell, a retired Forestry Service ranger with a weathered face that mapped decades under Montana skies, had developed a grudging respect for the newcomer. Smart animal was his highest praise, delivered while sharing scraps of his morning bacon with Ray beneath the breakfast table when he thought no one was looking. The first truly strange incident came exactly 10 days after Ray's rescue. Sarah had been gathering laundry from the clothesline, enjoying the earthy scent of sun-dried cotton, when she noticed Ray standing rigidly at the edge of the yard, his attention fixed on the distant railroad tracks. The dog's posture radiated tension, ears forward, tail straight, the picture of alert distress. Before Sarah could call to him, Ray bolted, covering ground with the fluid grace of a much younger animal. By the time she realized he was heading for the tracks, he had already disappeared into the aspen grove. "Ray!" she shouted, dropping the laundry basket and breaking into a run. "Ray, come back!" Noah, playing in his portable playpen on the porch under Ellen's watchful eye, began wailing the moment the dog vanished from sight. That same inconsolable cry he'd produced when they'd first heard Ray's distress. Sarah followed the path to the tracks, calling the dog's name with increasing urgency. When she emerged from the trees, she found Ray at the exact spot where he'd been tied up, circling the area with his nose to the ground, whining softly. When he saw her, he barked once, then returned to his investigation as though trying to communicate something of vital importance. "What is it, boy?" Sarah approached slowly. "There's nothing here now." But as she knelt beside the dog, she noticed something half buried between the wooden railroad ties, a glint of metal catching the afternoon sun. Using a stick, she carefully dug around it, unearthing a small metal tag that had clearly broken Off a collar, the engraving was partially worn away, but she could make out 3 letters, Ray. "So that really is your name," she murmured, turning the tag over in her palm. The reverse side bore a partial phone number, the first 3 digits matching Pinehaven's area code, but the remaining numbers were too scratched to decipher. Ray nudged her hand with his muzzle, then resumed circling the area, his behavior growing, increasingly agitated. Sarah scanned their surroundings, seeing nothing unusual, except for an ancient water tower that stood about 50 yards down the tracks. A relic from the steam engine days that had somehow survived decades of neglect. "Come on, Ray, let's go home." She patted her thigh, but the dog ignored the command, instead trotting determinedly toward the water tower. With a sigh, Sarah followed. The tower's wooden structure had weathered to a silvery grey, its metal tank long since claimed by rust. A maintenance ladder ran up one side, its lower rungs missing, a safety precaution to prevent children from climbing. At the base of the tower, Ray began pawing at the ground, unearthing what appeared to be a small glass jar. Sarah knelt beside him, carefully extracting the jar from the dirt. Inside was a folded piece of paper, protected from the elements by the sealed container. She hesitated, feeling like an intruder in someone else's private moment, but Ray's insistent whining convinced her to twist open the lid. The note inside was written on graph paper, the handwriting neat but pressed so hard into the page that the pen had nearly torn through in places. "Eleanor, I'll watch over our boy somehow. I promise. This wasn't your fault. Daniel." Sarah reread the cryptic message several times, trying to make sense of it. Who were Eleanor and Daniel? And who was our boy? She turned to Ray, who had settled onto his haunches, watching her, with those eerily intelligent eyes. "Do you know these people?" she asked, feeling slightly foolish for expecting an answer from a dog. Ray tilted his head, then looked pointedly in the direction of town, before returning his gaze to her face. Once again, Sarah had the distinct impression that the animal was trying to communicate something specific, something important. She pocketed the note and jar, and this time when she called Ray to follow, he obeyed without hesitation. As they walked back to the house, Sarah found herself wondering about the dog's origins with renewed curiosity. What connection did he have to the mysterious Daniel and Eleanor? And why had someone tried to eliminate him in such a cruel manner? Over dinner that evening, Sarah showed the note to her parents. Ellen squinted at the faded handwriting, while Frank cleaned his glasses on the edge of the tablecloth, a habit that had annoyed his wife for 40 years of marriage. "Daniel," Frank mused, settling the glasses back on his nose. "You know, that reminds me of Daniel Harmon. The train engineer?" Ellen looked up sharply. "But he's been gone for years." "Who's Daniel Harmon?" Sarah asked, bouncing Noah on her knee while surreptitiously slipping bits of chicken to Ray under the table. Frank leaned back in his chair, entering the storytelling mode that had captivated Sarah throughout her childhood. "Used to work for Burlington Northern. Quiet fellow, kept to himself mostly. Had a wife named Eleanor. Pretty woman, used to volunteer at the library. They lived in that blue Victorian at the end of Maple Street. The abandoned one?" Sarah pictured the dilapidated house that local children claimed was haunted. "It wasn't always abandoned," Ellen interjected, clearing plates from the table. "They were happy there until the accident." "What accident?" Sarah felt a chill, despite the warm evening. Her parents exchanged glances, communicating in that silent language of long-married couples. Finally, Frank sighed. Their son, must have been about 4 at the time, wandered onto the tracks. Daniel was working that day, engineer on a freight train. By the time he saw the boy, Ellen made a small sound of distress. "It was awful. The whole town felt it. Eleanor had a breakdown, ended up at that facility in Great Falls. Daniel just disappeared. Some said he couldn't live with himself, being at the controls when it happened. Left town in the middle of the night about 3 years ago. No one's heard from him since. 3 years, Sarah repeated softly, looking down at Ray, who had positioned himself directly against her chair, head resting on his paws but eyes alert. What was their son's name? Frank's brow furrowed in concentration. Matthew, I think, or Michael, something with an M. And did Daniel have a dog? Sarah asked, a theory beginning to form in her mind. A German shepherd specifically. Ellen nodded slowly. He did, now that you mention it. Used to bring it to the community picnics. That dog was devoted to him, wouldn't leave his side. For a second, Sarah reached down to stroke Ray's head, her mind racing through implications. I think Ray belonged to Daniel Harmon, and I think someone found him recently and tried to recreate the accident that took his son, right on the same stretch of tracks. Frank shook his head. But why? Daniel wasn't exactly beloved in town after everything that happened, but he wasn't hated either. Most folks just felt sorry for him. I don't know, Sarah admitted, but I'm going to find out. That night, after putting Noah to bed, Sarah sat on the porch swing with her laptop, researching Daniel and Eleanor Harmon. There wasn't much to find. A few mentions in the local newspaper archives about Daniel's work with the railroad, a brief obituary for Eleanor's father, a single photograph from a community event showing a tall, solemn-faced man with a German shepherd sitting alertly at his feet. The dog in the picture could have been Ray's twin. As midnight approached, Sarah's eyelids grew heavy. She was about to head inside when Ray, who had been dozing beside the swing, suddenly lifted his head and growled. A low, warning rumble, unlike any sound she'd heard him make before. Following his gaze, Sarah peered into the darkness beyond the porch light's reach. At first, she saw nothing. Then a flicker of movement caught her eye, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness near the barn, moving with deliberate stealth toward the house. Ray's growl intensified, and he positioned himself between Sarah and the approaching figure. She reached for her phone, finger poised over the emergency call button, when the visitor stepped into the pool of light cast by the porch lamp. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that might once have been handsome before grief carved its permanent lines into his features. Gray streaked his dark beard, and his eyes, fixed not on Sarah but on the German shepherd standing guard before her, held a mixture of disbelief and something that looked remarkably like hope. "Ray?" The man's voice cracked on the single syllable. "Is that really you, boy?" The German shepherd's entire demeanor transformed. His growl ceased, replaced by a high-pitched whine of recognition. His tail, usually carried with dignified restraint, began to wag so violently that his entire body shook with the force of it. Sarah stood, one hand still gripping her phone. "You're Daniel Harmon, aren't you?" The man standing in the pool of yellow porch light looked as though he'd been caught in headlights, frozen between fight and flight. At the sound of his name, he took an instinctive step backward, but Ray was already bounding down the steps, nearly knocking him over in a frenzy of joyful reunion. The German shepherd whined, circled, and finally reared up to place his paws on the man's shoulders, covering his bearded face with enthusiastic licks. "Down, boy, down." Daniel Harmon's voice was rough with emotion as he knelt to embrace the dog properly, burying his face in Ray's thick fur for a long moment. When he finally looked up at Sarah, his eyes were red-rimmed. "How did you find him?" Sarah hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Actually, he found us. Someone had tied him to the railroad tracks about a week ago." Daniel's expression darkened. "The tracks? Near the water tower?" "Yes," Sarah confirmed, watching his reaction carefully. "Right where you left that note for Eleanor." The color drained from Daniel's face. He sank onto the porch steps, one, and still gripping Ray's collar, as though afraid the dog might vanish if he let go. "You found that after all this time?" "Ray dug it up," Sarah explained, then introduced herself, sensing the man needed a moment to collect himself. She offered coffee, which he accepted with a grateful nod that revealed more about his exhaustion than words could have. Inside the farmhouse kitchen, Ellen, startled at the sight of their visitor, but recovered quickly, her natural hospitality overriding curiosity as she busied herself with the coffee pot. Frank entered from the living room, recognition dawning on his weathered features. "Daniel." "Herman," he stated simply, extending a hand. "Been a long time." Daniel nodded, shaking Frank's hand with a firm grip despite his apparent weariness. "Mr. Mitchell, didn't realize this was your place when I tracked Ray here." "Tracked him?" Sarah asked, setting mugs on the table. Daniel glanced toward the hallway, where baby sounds occasionally filtered through the monitor on the counter. "My dog's been missing for 2 weeks. I've been looking everywhere for him. Then yesterday, I heard rumors in town about a German shepherd being rescued from the tracks." He swallowed hard. "I nearly didn't believe it when I heard where he'd been found, of all places." They settled around the kitchen table, Ray positioning himself at Daniel's feet with his muzzle resting on the man's boot. The dog's eyes remained alert, tracking every movement as though afraid his master might disappear again. "Folk thought you'd left Pinehaven for good," Frank remarked, stirring sugar into his coffee. 3 years is a long absence." Daniel stared into his mug. "I did leave, couldn't bear to stay after everything that happened. Took Ray and just drove. Ended up working odd jobs in Wyoming, then Idaho. Construction mostly. Places where no one knew me or what had happened." "What brought you back?" Ellen asked gently. A muscle worked in Daniel's jaw. "Eleanor. She's not well. The facility called me about a month ago. I'd kept my number on her emergency contacts. Said she was asking for me, more lucid than she'd been in years." He rubbed a hand across his face. "I couldn't ignore that. So I came back, rented a cabin up near Blackwater Ridge. Been seeing her 3 times a week." "And Ray?" Sarah prompted. "He's been with me the whole time until—" Daniel's voice hardened. "Until someone took him from outside the grocery store 2 weeks ago. I'd left him tied up while I ran in for supplies. When I came out, he was gone, cut right through his leash." Sarah described finding Ray on the tracks, careful to emphasize that she'd reached him well before the train. As she spoke, she noticed Daniel's hands trembling slightly, his knuckles white around the coffee mug. "It wasn't random," he finally said, words barely audible. "Someone knew exactly what they were doing, making it happen all over again, but with Ray this time." "Making what happen?" Sarah asked, though she sensed she already knew the answer. Daniel set his mug down carefully, as though afraid it might shatter in his grip. "My boy, my Mason. He was playing in our yard. Eleanor was gardening, just turned her back for a minute. He wandered off, followed our cat through. A hole in the fence, ended up on the tracks." His breathing became shallow. "I was at the controls that day. Saw a small figure on the tracks too late to stop a fully loaded freight train. Didn't know, I couldn't see clearly enough to know. It was my own son until it was over." The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the old wall clock and Ray's soft whining as he pressed closer to Daniel's leg. "I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered, her heart aching for the unimaginable burden this man had carried. Daniel acknowledged her sympathy with a tight nod. "After it happened, Eleanor couldn't even look at me. Not that I blame her. I was the man who couldn't stop the train in time to save our child. She had a breakdown, ended up institutionalized. I stayed for a while, but every face in town seemed to be asking the same question. How could you not recognize your own son on those tracks? Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. Left Ray with my brother for a while, but came back for him a few months later. He's been the only family I've had since." "But who would want to hurt Ray?" Ellen asked. "And why now, just when you've returned?" "That's what I can't figure," Daniel admitted. "Not many people even know I'm back in the area. I've kept to myself, only going into town for necessities." Sarah thought of Noah, now peacefully sleeping down the hall, and felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her. Ray has formed an unusual bond with my son, she said carefully, watching Daniel's reaction. It's almost as if he recognized him somehow. Daniel looked up sharply. Your boy, Noah, is it? How old is he? 6 months, Sarah replied. Why? A shadow crossed Daniel's face. Mason would have been 4 when the accident happened. It's been 3 years since then, so he'd be... He trailed off, mental calculations apparently leading to a conclusion that troubled him. 7, Frank supplied. He'd be 7 now. Daniel nodded distractedly, his focus shifting to the hallway. As a small cry came through the baby monitor, Ray was immediately on his feet, ears perked toward the sound. Before anyone could react, the dog trotted purposefully down the hall toward the nursery. He does that every time Noah makes a noise, Sarah explained, rising to follow. It's like he's appointed himself guardian. She led Daniel to the nursery doorway, where they paused to watch Ray gently nudging the side of Noah's crib with his nose. The baby, who had been fussing, immediately calmed at the sight of the dog, reaching tiny fingers toward the familiar furry face. Daniel observed the interaction with an expression of bewilderment. Mason used to do that. Reach for Ray just like that. They were inseparable from the day we brought Mason home from the hospital. His voice roughened. Ray would sleep under his crib every night. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm summer evening. Noah seems to communicate with him somehow. The day I found Ray on the tracks, Noah started crying at the exact moment we heard Ray howling, before we could even see him. It was like he knew. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching as Noah drifted back to sleep under Ray's watchful gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. There's something I haven't told you, something that might sound crazy. Sarah thought about the inexplicable connection between her son and this dog, about the mysterious return of a man who had fled his past, about the deliberate placement of Ray on those fateful tracks. I'm starting to think crazy is relative. Around here, she said softly. Daniel nodded, seemingly making a decision. After Mason's accident, I was in a dark place, started drinking too much, couldn't sleep. One night I found myself at the tracks, right where it happened. I brought a bottle of whiskey intending to... He paused, searching for the right words. I wasn't planning on coming home that night. Sarah felt her throat tighten with understanding. Ray found me there, Daniel continued. Don't know how he got out of the house, but suddenly he was beside me on those tracks, pushing against me, barking like I'd never heard him bark before. When I wouldn't move, he grabbed my arm in his mouth. Didn't bite down hard, just held on and pulled. Then he did something I still can't explain. He looked me right in the eyes, and I swear I heard Mason's voice in my head saying, "Not yet, Dad." The nursery was silent, except for Noah's soft breathing and the gentle thump of Ray's tail against the floor. That night, I wrote the note to Eleanor and buried it by the water tower. It was a promise that I'd find a way to watch over our son wherever his spirit might be. Ray has been with me ever since, like he was keeping me to that promise. Sarah glanced at Noah, peacefully sleeping with one tiny hand still outstretched toward where Ray kept vigil. And now he's watching over my son. Daniel nodded slowly. I don't have explanations for any of this. All I know is that Ray has been trying to tell me something ever since Mason, since the accident. And somehow, it led him here, to your boy. They retreated to the hallway, leaving Noah under Ray's protective watch. As they walked back toward the kitchen, Sarah felt questions multiplying in her mind. Daniel, do you have any idea who might have taken Ray and tied him to the tracks? Someone who knew about your past, obviously, but who would be cruel enough to recreate your worst nightmare? Daniel's expression hardened. I have a suspicion. There was an investigation after Mason's accident. Standard procedure when there's a fatality on the tracks. The company cleared me of any wrongdoing. I followed all protocols, applied emergency brakes as soon as I spotted something on the tracks. But one person never accepted that conclusion, Eleanor's brother, Victor Reeves. Victor Reeves, Sarah repeated, the name vaguely familiar. Does he live in town? He moved to Pinehaven right after it happened, supposedly to support his sister. But all he did was feed her delusions that I was somehow at fault, that I could have stopped if I'd been paying proper attention. Daniel's voice grew bitter. He never said it outright, but he implied I might have been drinking on the job, that I'd covered it up. None of it was true, but grief makes people look for someone to blame. Sarah remembered now. Victor Reeves, the man who had opened the outdoors equipment store on Main Street a few years back. She'd seen him around town occasionally, a stocky, red-faced man with an aggressive handshake and a smile that never reached his eyes. Would he go so far as to hurt an animal just to get back at you? She asked. Daniel's expression was grim. Victor was always intense, and he doted on Eleanor even before the accident. When she had her breakdown, he seemed to channel all his rage toward me. Last I heard, he was still feeding her stories about how I was the villain in all this. Have you seen him since you returned? No, but... Daniel hesitated. Yesterday at the hospital, Eleanor was agitated, kept saying he's back. Vic said he's back over and over. I thought she meant me, but the timing fits with when Ray disappeared. Somehow Victor found out I'd returned and took Ray as some twisted form of revenge. Sarah glanced back toward the nursery where her son slept under the watchful eye of a dog who seemed to bridge worlds she couldn't comprehend. We need to be careful then. If Victor targeted Ray, and now Ray is here with Noah, the implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Daniel's face darkened with resolve. I won't let anything happen to your son, Sarah, or to Ray. I've lost too much already to let anyone else suffer because of my past. As they rejoined her parents in the kitchen, Sarah felt a sense of foreboding, but also a strange certainty that the arrival of this broken man and his extraordinary dog was not accidental. Something larger than coincidence was at work here. Something that had begun on those railroad tracks years ago and was now weaving their lives together in ways none of them could have anticipated. Ellen, practical as always, insisted Daniel take the spare room for the night. It's too late to be driving back to that cabin, especially with everything that's happened. Ray would probably appreciate a night with his master too. Daniel accepted with visible gratitude. As Sarah prepared fresh sheets for the guest room, she glanced out the window at the distant silhouette of the water tower, barely visible in the moonlight. Whatever secrets remained buried along those tracks, she sensed they were about to resurface, ready or not. For now, though, the house was quiet. Her son was safe, and the dog who had brought them all together was finally reunited with his master. Tomorrow would bring its own revelations. Morning arrived with the gentle persistence of early summer in Montana. Golden light spilling across the floorboards, birdsong filtering through partially opened windows, and the comforting scent of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Sarah woke to find Noah already awake in his crib, quietly babbling to Ray, who had somehow managed to slip into the nursery during the night and now stood guard with his front paws on the crib rail, tail wagging gently as the baby reached for his ears. You're supposed to be with your owner, Sarah murmured to the dog, who acknowledged her with a quick glance before returning his attention to Noah. The sound of men's voices drifted from the kitchen, her father and Daniel deep in conversation. As Sarah approached with Noah on her hip, she caught fragments about the railroad, maintenance schedules, and names of workers she didn't recognize. Both men fell silent when she entered. Sleep well? Ellen asked, sliding a plate of pancakes onto the table. Well enough, Sarah replied, settling Noah into his high chair. Though it seems someone had a midnight adventure. She nodded toward Ray, who had followed her into the kitchen and promptly positioned himself beside Noah's chair. Daniel smiled. The first genuine smile she'd seen from him, transforming his face into something younger, less burdened. Ray's always been good at getting through closed doors, used to drive Eleanor crazy. The mention of his wife sobered him quickly. I should head out soon. Eleanor's expecting me at visiting hours. Before you go, Frank said, pushing his empty plate. Aside, there's something you should know. I've been thinking about those tracks where Ray was found. Burlington Northern is planning to decommission that section next month, part of their infrastructure updates. They're rerouting the line about a mile west, where it'll connect to the newer service road. Daniel frowned. They're taking out the water tower too? Already scheduled for demolition, Frank confirmed, which means if someone wanted to recreate what happened to your boy, they knew it had to be now. Once those tracks are gone, the symbolism would be lost, Sarah finished, a chill running through her despite the warm kitchen. Daniel stood abruptly. I need to get to the hospital. If Victor really is behind this, Eleanor might know more than she's letting on. Sarah made a quick decision. I'm coming with you. Dad, can you and Mom watch Noah for a few hours? Ellen was already reaching for her grandson. Of course, but Sarah, are you sure about this? If Victor Reeves really did something as cruel as tying that dog to the tracks, he's not someone you want to tangle with. I'm already tangled in this, Sarah replied, thinking of the inexplicable bond between Noah and Ray. Besides, two people asking questions might get more answers than one. 30 minutes later, they were in Daniel's weather-beaten pickup truck, heading toward Pine Valley Memorial, the small regional hospital that housed the county's only psychiatric facility. Ray had been reluctant to leave Noah, but eventually settled in the truck bed after Sarah promised they'd return soon. As Daniel drove, Sarah studied his profile, the strong jawline now partially obscured by his beard, the creases around his eyes that spoke of years squinting against sun reflected off train windshields. There was something inherently trustworthy about him, she decided, a steadiness that must have served him well as an engineer responsible for thousands of tons of rolling steel. Thank you, he said unexpectedly, breaking the comfortable silence, for saving Ray and for, he gestured vaguely, not thinking I'm completely insane after everything I told you last night. I'm a single mother who returned to her hometown after her fiancé decided fatherhood wasn't in his 5-year plan. Sarah replied with a wry smile. I've learned to suspend judgment. Daniel glanced at her. Noah's father isn't in the picture at all? Jason's contribution to parenthood was a text message saying he wasn't ready for this level of commitment and a check that barely covered 2 months of diapers. Sarah hadn't meant to sound bitter, but the words carried an edge she hadn't fully resolved yet. Sorry, still working through that. No apology needed, Daniel assured her. Raising a child alone, that takes courage. I'm not entirely alone, Sarah acknowledged. My parents have been amazing, and now, apparently, we have a German Shepherd bodyguard too. Daniel's expression grew serious. About that, the way Ray is with Noah. It's not just normal dog behavior. I've never seen him connect with anyone the way he did with Mason. Until your son. What do you think it means? Daniel stared straight ahead at the ribbon of asphalt stretching through pine forests. I don't know, but when I was at my lowest point after Mason's accident, I read everything I could about what comes after. Reincarnation, soul connections, things I'd never given a second thought to before. He glanced at her, gauging her reaction. Does that sound crazy to you? Sarah thought of Noah's instant recognition of Ray, the immediate bond that had formed between them. No, she said finally, it doesn't sound crazy at all. Pine Valley Memorial was a modest 3-story structure of red brick and narrow windows, a former tuberculosis sanitarium repurposed for modern healthcare. The psychiatric wing occupied the entire 3rd floor, accessible only through a secure entrance where a nurse checked their identification and had Daniel sign a visitor log. Ms. Harmon's been asking for you, the nurse informed him with a smile. It's one of her good days. Who's your friend? Family friend, Daniel replied smoothly. Eleanor remembers Sarah from before. The nurse nodded, seemingly satisfied, and buzzed them through to a sunny communal area where several patients were engaged in various activities: reading, puzzles, art therapy. Eleanor Harmon sat in a wheelchair by the window, her thin frame draped in a pale blue cardigan. Despite the summer warmth, her hair, prematurely silver, was pulled back in a loose braid, and her delicate features bore the translucent quality of someone who had spent years indoors. Daniel? She smiled as they approached, her voice soft but clear. You brought someone. This is Sarah Mitchell, Daniel said gently, pulling chairs close to Eleanor's wheelchair. She wanted to meet you. Eleanor's eyes, a striking clear blue, studied Sarah with unexpected intensity. Mitchell? Frank and Ellen's daughter? The one who moved to Seattle? Sarah nodded, surprised. Yes, that's right. I'm back now with my son Noah. A shadow passed across Eleanor's face. A little boy? How old? 6 months, Sarah replied. Eleanor nodded slowly, her gaze drifting back to the window. Mason would have loved a baby. He was always asking for a little brother. She turned back to Daniel, her expression sharpening. Ray found them, didn't he? Just like I said he would. Daniel reached for his wife's fragile hand. Yes, Eleanor, Ray found them. He's safe now. Victor was so angry when he found out. Eleanor continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. Said you had no right to come back here, to disturb everything. After all this time, Daniel and Sarah exchanged glances. Eleanor, he asked carefully, did Victor tell you he was going to do something to Ray? Eleanor's fingers began plucking nervously at her cardigan. He said things had to be set right, that you needed to understand what it felt like to lose something you loved on those tracks. Her eyes filled with tears. I told him not to hurt Ray, but he said it was poetic justice. That's what he called it, poetic justice. Sarah felt sick at the calculated cruelty. Daniel's face had gone pale, his jaw clenched in a rigid line. Did Victor admit he took Ray? He asked, his voice strained with controlled anger. Eleanor nodded, tears now spilling down her cheeks. He said he saw you in town, followed you to the grocery store, said it was too perfect an opportunity to pass up. She gripped Daniel's hand suddenly, her eyes wide with fear. But Ray got away, didn't he? Victor was so angry, came in here, ranting about how someone had interfered, how his plan was ruined. Ray's safe, Daniel assured her. He's with us now. Eleanor's expression cleared momentarily. With the baby, that's good. That's how it should be. She smiled, a distant look coming into her eyes. I always knew Mason would find a way back to us. Daniel exchanged a glance with Sarah, then turned back to his wife. Eleanor, honey, what do you mean? The dreams, Eleanor said simply, as though it were obvious. After Mason was gone, I started having these dreams where he told me he'd come back someday. That we shouldn't be sad because it wasn't really goodbye. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. The doctor said it was just grief, that I was creating comfort fantasies. But they felt so real, Daniel, and Ray knew. He always knew. That's why he stayed by me until you came back for him. Sarah felt goosebumps rise along her arms. Mrs. Harmon, she asked gently, in these dreams, did Mason say how he would come back? Eleanor's gaze drifted from Sarah to Daniel and back again. He said we would know him by how Ray reacted, that Ray would recognize his soul even if we couldn't. She smiled, the expression transforming her thin face into something luminous. Ray found your baby, didn't he? That's why you're here. Before Sarah could respond, the door to the common room swung open with unnecessary force. A stocky man with thinning red hair and a florid complexion strode in, his eyes locking immediately on their small group by the window. Well, isn't this cozy? He said. voice carrying across the room and drawing looks from the other patients and staff. The runaway husband finally returns, and he's brought a friend. Daniel stood slowly, positioning himself slightly in front of Sarah. "Hello, Victor. Been a while." Victor Reeves ignored the greeting, focusing instead on Eleanor. "I told you, it wasn't worth waiting for, Ellie. 3 years without so much as a Christmas card, and now suddenly he's visiting daily." He turned cold eyes on Daniel. "What are you really after, Harmon? The house? Insurance money? God knows it's not my sister. You care about or you wouldn't have abandoned her." "That's enough," Daniel said quietly, though Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. "Eleanor and I are having a conversation. You can wait your turn." Victor's face darkened further, a vein pulsing visibly at his temple. "This is my visiting time. Always has been. Tuesday mornings, 10 to 11. You know that." He looked at Sarah, eyes narrowing. "Who's she? Your new girlfriend. Couldn't wait for my sister to be officially committed before moving on." "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she replied before Daniel could intervene, standing to face Victor directly. "I recently helped rescue a German shepherd that someone had cruelly tied to the railroad tracks outside my family's property." She held his gaze steadily. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Mr. Reeves?" Victor's expression flickered, surprise quickly masked by defensive anger. "I have no idea what you're talking about, and I don't appreciate strangers making accusations in front of my sister." "It's not an accusation if it's true," Eleanor said unexpectedly, her voice stronger than before. "You told me yourself what you did to Ray, Victor. You were proud of it." Victor's face contorted with betrayal. "Ellie, you're confused again. The doctors said your memory—" "I'm not confused," Eleanor interrupted, a spark of her former self showing through the fragile exterior. "Not today. I remember exactly what you said, that Daniel needed to suffer like we suffered. But Ray didn't deserve that. And Mason," her voice broke slightly, "Mason would have been so angry with you for hurting his dog." A nurse had begun moving toward them, alerted by the escalating tension. Victor noticed and immediately modulated his tone, forcing a concerned smile. "Ellie's having one of her episodes," he explained loudly. "Mixing up reality again. Dr. Peterson said this might happen when she's upset." "I'm not having an episode," Eleanor insisted, looking to Daniel for support. "Tell them, Daniel, tell them about Ray and the baby." Victor seized on this, his smile turning triumphant. "A baby? See what I mean? Now she's inventing children. Mason was our only nephew, and he's been gone for 3 years. Sarah stepped forward. "She's talking about my son, Noah. Your sister isn't confused at all." Victor's eyes darted between them, calculation replacing his artificial concern. "I don't know what game you're playing, Harmon, but dragging strangers into our family tragedy is a new low, even for you." Daniel's voice was quiet, but carried an unmistakable warning. "No games, Victor. We know what you did to Ray." Eleanor just confirmed it. "The only question is whether we take this information to Sheriff Braden now, or give you a chance to come clean on your own." Victor's composure cracked, revealing the anger beneath. "You can't prove anything. And who would believe you anyway? The man who couldn't even recognize his own son on the tracks, the man who ran away rather than face what he'd done." "Stop it," Eleanor cried, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't Daniel's fault. It was an accident, a terrible accident. Mason wasn't supposed to be anywhere near those tracks. And whose job was it to watch him that day?" Victor shot back, years of bitterness erupting. "You were gardening. Ellie, you turned your back for 5 minutes and he wandered off. But of course no one wants to blame the grieving mother, do they? Much easier to vilify the engineer who couldn't stop the train in time." A heavy silence fell over their corner of the room. Eleanor's sobs were the only sound until Daniel spoke, his voice hollow with realization. "That's what this is always. been about, hasn't it? You couldn't stand that Eleanor blamed herself, so you made sure all that guilt transferred to me instead." Victor's silence was confirmation enough. The nurse who had been hovering nearby stepped forward, a worried crease between her brows. "I think we need to give Mrs. Harmon some space now," she said firmly. "All this upset isn't good for her progress." As the nurse wheeled Eleanor away, the older woman reached for Daniel's hand one last time. "Find Mason," she whispered urgently. "Ray knows. Ray has always known." Sarah and Daniel stood in awkward silence with Victor, whose anger seemed to have drained away, leaving something harder and colder in its place. "This isn't over," he said quietly, "not by a long shot." As he turned to leave, Sarah found her voice. "Mr. Reeves," she called after him, "if anything happens to Ray or to my son or to anyone else involved in this situation, we'll know exactly who's responsible. And animal cruelty charges will be the least of your concerns." Victor paused, his back to them. Without turning, he replied, "Interesting that you immediately assume your son might be in danger, Ms. Mitchell. I never mentioned anything about a child." With that parting shot, he pushed through the double doors and was gone. Outside, in the hospital parking lot, Sarah leaned against Daniel's truck, trying to process everything they'd learned. The summer sun beat down on the asphalt, creating heat mirages that shimmered like water in the distance. As unreal and distorted as the situation they found themselves in, "He just threatened Noah," she said finally, anger displacing shock. "He all but admitted what he did to Ray, and then threatened my baby." Daniel's expression was grave as he unlocked the truck doors. "We should go straight to Sheriff Braden, file a report about Ray, get a restraining order against Victor." Sarah nodded, climbing into the passenger seat. As Daniel started the engine, her phone rang, her mother's number flashing on the screen. An inexplicable sense of dread washed over her as she answered. "Sarah, thank goodness." Ellen's voice was tight with worry. "You need to come home right now. Ray's gone crazy, barking, scratching at the doors, and Noah won't stop crying. It's like they both know something's wrong. Frank's trying to calm them, but..." A crash sounded in the background, followed by her father's muffled swearing. "Just hurry home, Sarah, please." She ended the call, turning to Daniel with fear clutching at her throat. "We need to get back to the farm, now." Daniel didn't waste time asking questions. He threw the truck into reverse, tires squealing as they peeled out of the hospital parking lot. As they sped down the county highway toward the Mitchell farm, Sarah found herself gripping the door handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. What did Eleanor mean? She asked, needing conversation to distract from her mounting anxiety. About Mason coming back, about Ray knowing. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, pushing the truck well beyond the posted speed limit. After the accident, Eleanor became obsessed with the idea of reincarnation. Said Mason had promised to return in her dreams. I thought it was just grief talking, a mother's desperate need to believe her child wasn't really gone. He glanced at Sarah briefly. But then there's Ray's behavior. With Noah, the unspoken possibility hung between them as the truck sped toward whatever awaited them at the Mitchell farm. Sarah found herself thinking about the day she'd found Ray on the tracks. How Noah had somehow known the dog was in distress before they'd even heard his cries. The immediate bond that had formed between them, the way Ray positioned himself as Noah's protector from day one. What if Eleanor's grief-born beliefs weren't delusions after all? What if some connections truly did transcend the boundaries between life and death? And if Victor had once been willing to hurt an animal to exact his revenge against Daniel, what might he do if he believed his nephew's soul had somehow returned in the form of Noah Mitchell? The Mitchell farmhouse came into view as Daniel's truck crested the final hill, tires kicking up clouds of dust along the gravel driveway. From a distance, everything appeared normal, but as they drew closer, Ray's frantic barking became audible even through the closed windows. "Something's wrong," Sarah said, hand already on the door handle before they'd fully stopped. Ellen met them at the door, visibly distressed. "Thank God you're back. Ray's been like this for almost an hour, and Noah won't stop crying." In the living room, Ray was alternating between pacing near the front window and rushing to Noah's playpen, where Frank was attempting to comfort the inconsolable infant. The German shepherd's fur stood on end, a low growl punctuating his barking. The moment Ray spotted them, he rushed over, circling urgently before darting back to the window. The message was clear: "Come look." He started acting like this right after a blue pickup drove past, Frank explained. "Turned around at the end of our road and headed back toward town." "Blue pickup?" Daniel's voice sharpened. "Victor drives a blue Ford." Sarah cradled Noah protectively. He was watching the house. After explaining their confrontation at the hospital and Victor's veiled threat, Frank called Sheriff Braden while the others made a quick plan. Sarah's parents would take Noah to town in Frank's truck, making sure Victor saw them leave with what appeared to be the entire family. Meanwhile, Daniel, Sarah, and Ray would head to the water tower, the symbolic heart of all that had transpired. "Keep him safe," Sarah said, handing her whimpering son to Ellen with an aching heart. Once her parents had driven away, followed by Victor's blue pickup, Sarah and Daniel slipped out the back door with Ray leading the way across the sun-drenched fields toward the railroad tracks. The water tower stood like a sentinel from another era, its metal tank rusted but intact, wooden supports weathered to a silvery gray. The railroad tracks gleamed in the sunlight, a path to everywhere and nowhere all at once. "This is where it happened," Daniel said quietly, eyes fixed on a point down the tracks where Mason had been lost. They didn't wait long. Within 20 minutes, Victor's blue pickup approached along the maintenance road. He emerged slowly, surprise evident when he spotted them waiting. Ray growled low in his throat, positioning himself protectively. "It's over, Victor," Daniel called. "Sheriff Braden is on his way. Eleanor told us everything." As Victor approached, Sarah could see grief and bitterness etched into his face, lines that mirrored Daniel's own, though carved by a different blade of the same trauma. "You have no right to be here," Victor said. "This place belongs to Eleanor and Mason's memory, not to the man who failed to save him." "Mason was my son," Daniel replied steadily. "I live with what happened every day, but it was an accident, Victor. A terrible, unimaginable accident that destroyed all our lives." "Accident?" Victor laughed bitterly. "You were responsible for that train, for watching the tracks. How do you not see a 4-year-old boy before it's too late? Because the sun was in my eyes, because I was rounding a bend at 40 miles per hour with a load that takes over a mile to stop, because Mason ran onto the tracks with no warning." Daniel's voice broke. "Because sometimes horrible things happen that no one can prevent." Victor's face contorted with pain. "Eleanor only turned away for a minute. She's my little sister. I've protected her since we were children. I couldn't let her carry that burden of guilt." "So you transferred it all to me," Daniel said with sad understanding. "Made me the villain in a tragedy that had no villains, only victims." Ray growled again, his attention fixed on something beyond Victor, a vibration beginning to thrum through the rails. A freight train was approaching. As the rumble grew louder, Victor's composure cracked. "Do you know what it's like to visit your sister in that place, week after week, to be the only one still fighting for Mason while everyone else moved on?" He gestured wildly toward the tracks. "I come here every Tuesday and promise Mason I haven't forgotten." The train's whistle sounded, a mournful cry that pierced through their accumulated grief. "I remember too," Daniel said softly. "Every day, every night, I see his face in my dreams. I'm his father. I will always remember." Something shifted. In Victor's expression, a reluctant recognition of the shared pain that connected them more deeply than their animosity ever could. Eleanor believes Mason's spirit has returned, Sarah said. That Ray recognized his soul in my son. Victor's eyes widened. She told you about her dreams. Sarah nodded. When I found Ray on these tracks, Noah somehow knew he was in danger, started crying at the exact moment Ray began howling before we could even hear him. There's a connection between them that defies explanation. The train rounded the bend, all three humans and Ray stepping back as the ground trembled beneath them. As the massive engine thundered past, Sarah watched Victor's face. The bitter lines of resentment softened into something approaching acceptance. When silence returned, Victor spoke quietly. I wanted someone to pay for what happened to Mason. I needed someone to blame. I know, Daniel replied simply. So did I. Sheriff Braden arrived, followed by Frank's truck. The confrontation that had been building for 3 years began to dissolve into something resembling the first step toward healing. Everything under control? The sheriff asked, scanning the unusual scene. Yes, Sarah answered with surprising certainty. I think we've reached an understanding. From Frank's truck, Noah's fussing drew Ray's immediate attention. The German shepherd trotted over as Ellen emerged with the baby. The instant Ray came into view, Noah's cries transformed into happy babbling, tiny fingers reaching for his furry guardian. Victor watched with undisguised wonder. He really does recognize the dog. The sheriff looked confused. Someone want to explain what's going on? Got reports about threats and trespassing. It was a misunderstanding, Daniel finally said. A family disagreement that got out of hand. And the dog tied to the railroad tracks? Braden asked skeptically. That was me, Victor admitted. A mistake I deeply regret. Lardy. After statements were taken and arrangements made for Victor's community service at the local animal shelter, life in Pinehaven gradually transformed. The railway company postponed removal of the old tracks, designating the area as a small memorial park. Victor discovered unexpected solace working with abandoned animals. Eleanor improved under outpatient care, and Daniel slowly restored the blue Victorian house. Ray divided his time between Daniel's home and the Mitchell farm, somehow knowing when he was needed in either location. One golden evening in late summer, Sarah sat on her porch swing with Daniel, watching Noah practice standing. Ray lay nearby, alert to every wobble, ready to provide furry support if needed. Eleanor asked about Noah again, Daniel said. Wants to meet him when she's ready. Sarah nodded, understanding. Whenever she feels up to it, no rush. I found something in the attic yesterday, Daniel continued. An old journal from when Eleanor was pregnant with Mason. We almost named him Noah. It was my father's name. The coincidence settled between them like a whispered confirmation of something neither quite dared name aloud. Ray lifted his head, eyes moving between them as though following their unspoken thoughts. Do you ever wonder? Sarah began. Every day, Daniel admitted, but I've stopped trying to explain it. Maybe some connections aren't meant to be understood, just honored. As dusk deepened into evening, stars appearing one by one above the Montana horizon, Sarah felt a sense of rightness settle over the unusual family they were becoming. Whatever forces had drawn them together, coincidence, fate, or something more profound, had created a circle of healing where once there had been only broken pieces. Ray stretched contentedly between Noah and the adults, sentinel and bridge, protector and guide. In his amber eyes was the wisdom of creatures who love without condition and recognize souls beyond flesh, who lead us home when we've forgotten the way. Later that night, with Noah sleeping peacefully and Ray standing his customary watch, Sarah joined Daniel on the porch. The vastness of the Montana night sky stretched above them, stars scattered like memories across the darkness. Thank you, Daniel said quietly, for saving Ray that day. Sarah slipped her hand into his. Maybe Ray saved all of us. The German shepherd appeared in the doorway, his silhouette outlined against the warm light from within. He regarded them solemnly before settling at their feet, guardian of thresholds, seen and unseen, keeper of a love that had found its way home at last. Dear listeners, we hope that the journey of Sarah, Daniel, and Ray has touched your hearts. Some connections in life cannot be explained by logic alone. They must be felt in the soul and honored with an open heart. Just as Ray knew the truth that others couldn't see, perhaps you too have experienced connections that defy explanation. We've created a special playlist with equally moving stories that explore the mysterious bonds between humans and animals, the power of healing after trauma, and the possibility that love transcends all boundaries. You'll find it by clicking to your left. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Every day, we bring you unique narratives that explore life's complexities and the extraordinary connections that bind us together. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced an inexplicable connection with an animal? Do you believe some souls find their way back to us? Your stories are as important as ours, and we can't wait to read them.